the Tablet of Destinies. The fates of gods and humans and even the universe were written on that. So whoever possessed the Tablet of Destinies, they had the right to rule over the universe.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural. Greetings, listeners. In this episode, we welcome back Dr. Heather Lynn, author of Evil Archeology and the Anunnaki Connection. Today, we're going to be talking about Egypt and Sumeria. We're going to spend a little bit of time addressing some of these issues with the Sumerian civilization from an archaeological perspective. And I would like to take a moment to address that there is this timeless fascination with ancient civilizations. We have this allure of their myths, and there's even this curious draw that we have to a golden age or a return to Eden experience. And across cultures, across eras and people groups, they've all looked back. We've all looked back to bygone times. We've all looked back to our childhoods when time might have been simpler. We look back at ancient cultures and ancient civilizations to times 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And we're fascinated with the extraordinary achievement, wisdom, and even the prosperity. When we look at the archaeological wonders, we look at the pyramids of Giza, the Parthenon, or the Great Wall of China. They all evoke this sense of awe and mystery. And we feel that these structures are not mere feats of engineering, but they're real, tangible symbols of human ingenuity and endurance. These artifacts and ruins that are uncovered by explorers and archaeologists, they tell stories of sophisticated societies with complex social structures. They've got advanced technologies, and their cultures seem more rich than what we have today. And sometimes when we look back, we're fascinated by the origins of ancient societies and the things that came to develop what we experience here in the modern era, where many aspects of our current society have these roots in ancient times. We find legal systems, languages, literature, mathematics, scientific principles have roots developed in the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia or Egypt or ancient Greece. And there's a certain sense of delight when we begin to understand these origins. They offer us a sense of continuity, connection to the past. There are many ancient cultures who even wrote about a golden era, golden age. We can look at Hesiod's Works and Days, which describes, the 5 ages of man, starting with the golden age when humans lived in harmony. They lived free from toil and suffering. We can look to Hinduism. They have a cosmology which speaks of the first and the purest of the 4 cyclical ages. How about in our Judeo-Christian tradition, the Garden of Eden, representing this paradise, this state of innocence and bliss before the fall of man. And even myths like Thomas More's Utopia or Shangri-La reflect these places or these ideals that society can be untouched by the ills of today. And as I wrap up this forethought exploration into the allure of ancient civilizations and Golden Age myths, I can't help but feel that there's something more beneath the surface, something hidden in plain sight. These ancient wonders and timeless tales are not just relics of the past. They're pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a truth that has been obscured by time and mysteries. We see echoes of a reality that challenges our understanding of human history and our potential. And why do these stories persist? Perhaps it's because they are more than mere fantasies. They might be memories of a time when humanity was closer to the truth, when we lived in harmony with forces and knowledge now lost to us. Or maybe, just maybe, these myths are whispers of something extra, something foreign, something outside of human comprehension. Evidence of some kind of influence that have shaped our world. In the end, our fascinations with these ancient tales and civilizations might be a yearning for forgotten knowledge, a connection to something greater than ourselves. It's as if our ancestors left breadcrumbs, urging us to seek the truth, to believe that there's more out there, beyond the stars, within our history, within ourselves. Remember, the truth is out there, in the shadows, waiting for us to find it.
Consider a world where encounters with unknown beings transcend the boundaries of science fiction, and where government secrets are not mere conspiracies but tangible realities. This pursuit involves navigating the murky waters of cryptic symbols, unexplainable phenomena, and entities that defy explanation. Returning to shed light on the darkness, she is the curator of crypto conspiracies, the surveyor of the supernatural, renegade archaeologist, Dr. Heather Lynn. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. As we were talking in the pre-show here, your new Ancient Aliens episode launched, talking about the ancient Sumerians, and I thought that would be a great segue for our show, considering last time we spoke about evil archaeology. And this time we can talk about some of your Anunnaki research. And one thing that got me going way back when I was a kid, I was really into Egypt. Everything Egypt, Osiris, Isis, Horus, all the bells and whistles and all the ancient things discovered, the pyramids. And then, well, I discovered Zachariah Stitchin, and he was talking about this place called Sumeria. And that began this whole quest, or this Sumeria-centric cycle of finding these ancient beings called the Anunnaki. And that's what I wanted to talk to you today about.
The Egyptians are obviously just absolutely amazing. They've captured the fascination of people for a very long time, including in their own time. The Romans went through their form of Egyptomania, and they started dressing like the ancient Egyptians and, sort of cosplaying ancient Egyptians. And it's
right.
Really interesting. At the Getty Villa in Malibu, It's a wonderful museum. They have a whole section that's devoted to some of the Roman clothing that was modeled after the Egyptians. And so people have been fascinated with Egypt and the Egyptian culture for so long, and for good reason. But, the Sumerians, they're starting to see their, 15 minutes of fame, hopefully,
right.
A little longer, because they're quite interesting as well. And in some ways, possibly a little more intriguing. And I say that for one thing. A couple reasons, but primarily they're much older than the ancient Egyptians. So they predate them. So that's pretty amazing. But also we actually have more data that they kept track of than we have from the Egyptian records. And that's because they wrote in clay tablets, which were very durable, all things considered, as compared to the Egyptians who wrote in paper, which
right.
Degrades over time. And so, and not to mention, it's a newer discovery, and a lot of the translations are sort of newer and unraveling now. bit by bit. There's not that many people that can actually translate cuneiform, just simply because, supply and demand
Right.
and that sort of thing. But what they've started to do recently was utilize AI to try to decipher those texts. So I'm not sure how I feel about that, but aside,
Well, yeah.
but, hey, we'll see what happens. We may start getting some stranger yet translations, but when I was teaching, I have to say, I've gone double renegade because I stopped earlier.
Yeah.
I stepped away again. I just had enough. I couldn't even. Just the state of academia is just beyond repair, and it is not my calling to be the one to fix it.
Yeah, fair enough.
So but when I was teaching, I focused on these ancient topics, obviously, and I used to ask students, "Anybody ever hear of the Sumerians?" And nobody. And I thought, oh, okay. And so I'd say, well, have you heard of the Egyptians? You get a few hands, which shocking. I would think everybody had heard of the Egyptians.
Okay.
And I would say, so like Egyptians, like, have you heard of King Tut? Or, and maybe one hand out of like 30, like one hand,
Yeah.
two hands. And I thought, what is going on? But when it came to the Sumerians, nobody, just crickets. It got a little better in recent years where, actually, thanks to shows like Ancient Aliens, which I know is like the bane of a lot of people's existence. But I have to say, those shows have really put, shows like that have put the Sumerians sort of out there in the public zeitgeist and captured the imagination of people. And so I saw a bit of an increase in students who were at least recognizing Sumerian culture and having an interest in it at all. But it's still kind of lesser known. So it's I think pretty fascinating because of that.
Well, one of the major problems that has come along with ancient Sumeria is the fact that they don't really fit with their neighbors. Their language doesn't fit. They don't seem to have a Semitic form of communication. And like you said, everything that they've written down is written down in the cuneiform clay tablets, which thankfully with the fires at Nineveh, we were able to find the Ashurbanipal library, and many of those were preserved because of the fire. They were baked clay tablets at that point. If we were to go all the way back, like Professor Ziskind of 1972, and he starts talking about the fact that these guys just don't fit, and the curious start of where they came from has intrigued me. I mean, especially considering other archaeological finds, Göbekli Tepe, for example. I mean, we're just finding stuff that's even far older than Sumeria.
I suspect that once they really get deeper into, no pun intended, but when they get deeper into Göbekli Tepe, they're going to find a lot of things that, will rewrite history completely. I know that's kind of a, we hear that a lot.
Right.
Most every time there's a press release about some interesting archaeological find, you'll hear, oh, this has the potential to rewrite human history. But in this particular case with Göbekli Tepe, it certainly does. It could even possibly push back human history to 12,500 years. Yeah. So and when I say history, I literally mean history, the historical record, which doesn't begin until Sumer. So, obviously there's prehistory, there's been cultures before that.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, there's different cultures and people living in those regions in Mesopotamia before the Sumerians. And they had their own sort of type of pottery and definitely culture, proto-writing, but they weren't considered civilization, right, as the academics would put it now. So there's like a criteria for what it takes to be considered a civilization. One of those things is a written record. So something a little more than just some glyphs or proto writing, and that definitely is the case with the Sumerians. And you're right, they don't fit. Their language doesn't fit the region. Everything is just seemingly out of place. And that's what led scholars to calling that particular problem the Sumerian problem. Right. How is it that this civilization sort of appeared seemingly out of nowhere with a different language than everybody else around, with great technology, and they were able to cultivate a society and a high civilization over the course of just 200 years, which is astonishing, really.
Right. And that was the whole thing, is before the rise of Sumerian civilization, we had no known permanent and organized settlements. I mean, even Göbekli Tepe itself doesn't fit because it doesn't have the same requirements of civilization, which are a communication hub, division of labor, resources like agriculture, etc. And Göbekli Tepe doesn't fit that profile either, but Sumeria, ancient Sumeria did. And this is really stunning because we don't understand where they came from. And not only that, but their creation epic is profoundly unique. The arrival of what they call the sages doesn't fit ancient Egypt.
Right. No, it doesn't. It almost sets the stage for everything to follow. You see that they set this almost like a template in place. A lot of that then later is due to religious syncretism and, the gods sort of, adapting and adjusting to different cultures. But you do see this establishment of, say, a pantheon of 12 particular gods and different gods underneath those. And you see the mystery traditions start. Mm-hmm. The idea of passing down secret knowledge, having to be initiated into particular degrees. You see pyramidal structures being built.
Right.
You see this whole very familiar framework starting, and then arguably inspiring the cultures that came up around it. So very impactful.
I was speaking with a guy and we were talking about, for example, the building of the Tower of Babel, for example. It's designed by this guy named Nimrod. And Nimrod's attributed to building Babel and Nineveh, these two places that are kind of far apart, to be honest. And I think they were quite a bit closer together. But the thing is, if we were to follow that story after like the Noetic flood, these guys, they come from the north to the south. And that's what the story of the Sumerians give, is they have their sages came from the north and they called them the dark-headed ones or the black-headed ones, for example. And it's like, well, why would they call them something different than what they were unless they were something else?
Exactly. I mean, if I have dark hair and you have dark hair and we see each other, we wouldn't say, hey, dark-headed one. You wouldn't even notice that necessarily. But it was clear that the individuals that came and taught them look different, and they were described as being taller, larger. You see that sort of discussed now in the context of them being giants, but I usually push back on that because when you say giants, it automatically conjures up a notion of Jack and the Beanstalk. Sure. Or that kind of thing. And so then you'll see online a bunch of pictures that have huge, like enormous skeletons where, there's archaeologists that have been photoshopped into their eye sockets. And it's like, yeah, well, there's still gravity and oxygen to consider, mm-hmm. And this sort of thing. So it doesn't do it justice. People then will throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, they weren't giants, or they'll point
giants
to
that size. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that when you consider they did say that they were much larger, and you look at the archaeological remains, the people that were found in those areas, their average height, at least based on the remains, would be about 5 foot at best. And so, semi-settled hunter-gatherers wouldn't have had access to the type of predictable nutrition necessary to become large and in charge, so to speak. Right. So, but if someone else, came by and they had already established agriculture and understood how to, have an abundance of food, and were able to then grow in stature to a point where, if it was somebody who was 6'3", and then you're looking at someone who's maybe 4'11", that would be pretty big. And especially if it's not just tall, but if it's tall and broad shoulders, large, strong, that sort of thing. So, that's where I tend to take the whole idea that they were giants.
Yeah.
Because
even 7 foot.
Otherwise it's, yeah. Yeah. So these individuals were large, and they say that in the text. They kind of depict it in their art, and the archaeological evidence sort of bears that possibility out as well.
Like I mentioned earlier, I mentioned Zachariah Stitchin, and as somebody who had taken it upon himself to start looking into the the Sumeriomania basically himself. And he ran with his own interpretation of his own making, which led to several books. And I think he was inspired by other authors who wrote about a paleo contact. It wasn't technically new for Zechariah to come up with, but it was definitely something that was fomenting in the human consciousness, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. About the time where he started writing, you have authors like von Daniken, especially hugely culturally impactful, talking about the possibility of paleo contact, writing Chariots of the Gods, and even having a documentary come out, sort of the prototype, I suppose, for Ancient Aliens. In a lot of ways, it sort of came out with more suggestions and questions rather than statements about the possibility of extraterrestrial contact. It also featured some of the sites that we're most familiar with today, having to do with the notion of ancient astronaut theory. So things like Stonehenge or Easter Island or the Nazca lines and that sort of thing. So it was becoming a very popular idea. And so he wasn't originating it, but what he did bring was his understanding of Hebrew and his understanding of language to look at those texts and translate them and more so interpret them. And, so I don't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily agree with all of his interpretations. I don't think many people really would. I mean, there are some diehard, cult of personality types, and I don't subscribe to that. Like I wouldn't subscribe to anybody in that situation, because it's supposed to be a scholarly endeavor. I mean, as fun as some of these topics are, if you're looking at it critically, you don't want to just say, well, this one guy in the 1970s wrote this one book and said this, and therefore that's it. He established everything. There's nothing else to talk about. So that's just comical to me. So I think that what he did was he opened the door for the discussion. He put out a lot of intriguing questions and some new ways of looking at things. And I also think that by putting out the book that he did and getting people excited about it, I think that he did something very important by sort of pushing the mainstream into having to address these issues. Because before that, when they discovered these tablets, once they started to not only discover them, but discover the translations, they were sort of stunned at the possibility that it could push back the biblical narrative by thousands of years. And they did not want to do that. Not because they were diehard Christians themselves, but because the society in the late Victorian, early Edwardian period was very Christian, particularly in Britain. And so they didn't want to have a social upheaval. And so they thought, well, this is something the public doesn't need to know about. And back then there wasn't necessarily a need to have a PR campaign around some of these archaeological excavations, because the funding was mostly from people in positions of wealth and power. It was like their hobby. Yes. And so so now, they sort of went back and they were looking at the information. They just never went out and publicly pushed this information. So there was a lull in it. Plus it takes a long time for people to translate. It wasn't a huge industry.
And that hasn't changed.
And so they didn't actually lie, I would say, but it was lying by omission. They just didn't do their due justice in informing the public, or at least getting them excited. And so Sitchin definitely did that when he comes out and says, hey guys, look what I found, even though he didn't find it, but he was responsible for bringing this out. And I think holding the academics a little more accountable, because then they have to say, wait, no, hold on. No, this didn't happen this way, or, well, it really happened this way, or, it just left them, in that position, which some of them were very upset about, because now they had to respond somehow. And, then that's when they go to the whole, it's pseudo-archaeology, or don't listen to that, or, so it's a tale as old as time. But he he had some interesting insights. Another thing I usually caution people about is that he had the one book, The 12th Planet, and that's where he laid out his thesis. It was a great book. He lays out his thesis. He does push the boundary, but that's his right. It's his book. It's his thesis.
Right.
But then what happens is he goes on and he publishes Earth Chronicles, which was a series of novels where he expands on all of these ideas in this fictionalized way, which is, again, fine. However, it gets lost in the mythos of Sitchin that he wrote a lot of fiction, and these ideas sort of go back and forth, and it's not real clear all the time to some of his loyal followers where fact and fiction sort of break. So that can pose some trouble.
Yeah, that's the trouble of the story. I mean, the most popular way of transmitting anything truth related is by story. I mean, that's the oldest form of tradition that we have today. But there's all these theories of ideas floating around of a golden age, of a time when the giants, Nephilim kind of giants, so 7, 8, 9, 10 foot, that leads to Saturn death cults, right? Seem to be driven into this desire of a golden age, a re-enlivening of a golden age, return to Eden kind of a thing. And it's like through time, you have Hitler looking for historical artifacts that are magical, right? The Spear of Longinus is kind of a common one. You see it in, DC's Constantine and a couple of other places. But the point is, this is where your massive secret societies end up, is this Saturnian worship. And it's really interesting because it deals with finding archaeological things and then keeping them secret. And you have actually spoken about funding on archaeological endeavors that line up what you said with the Edwardian times.
Yeah. It's important sometimes, I think, to remind people how new archaeology is as a field, and how actually, in a lot of ways, it's a soft science. And I think in most ways it's considered a soft science, which isn't to denigrate it, but it is a social science. And why that's important, I think, to remind people is that, it started out as a hobby called antiquarianism, and it was a hobby that only the wealthiest could participate in, and mostly wealthy who were people who, the type of wealthy individuals that wanted to colonize and be kind of imperial in nature. They were interested in other cultures, but they were interested in them for, exploiting their resources, and then also just, having an interest at the same time. So generally people who, had that sort of interest and money came from Europe, sometimes in America, but a lot of this we saw come up in Great Britain with the landed gentry. And so they would have these hobbies where, you have a lord, and, he'd sit around and think, well, I got all this money. I'd like to make my name. I want to kind of have an adventure. So I'll just go to Egypt.
Yeah.
And, and for those people who are familiar with the television show Downton Abbey on
there you go.
PBS, Highclere Castle is the actual lord of Highclere Castle in real life. He was the one responsible for funding the discovery of King Tut. And because of that, the collection, all of it, was housed at Highclere Castle, where they filmed Downton Abbey, in the basement. They still have some artifacts there. But that was just a typical thing where you'd have a grand country estate, and you'd have maybe at the minimum a cabinet of curiosities, which was actually a big room. And, you could have all of these interesting things that you essentially looted from all of these other countries,
yes,
and show your other rich friends, hey, look,
that's
at this
what museums are for.
Yeah. And that's interesting, because then around that time, people were starting to get very angry. There was a lot of uprisings politically, and after the war, people started thinking, this isn't right. The way that we're living isn't right. Time started to change, and they were starting to get worried that they would be next, because people's land, they were getting taken. There was this push towards a more socialism type structure. They thought people shouldn't have these grand estates. And so there was a lot of tumult, but some of the individuals who were very devoted to this quest of antiquarianism, they said, well, what we need to do is before they take it from us, we need to give it to them. And so we'll do things like we'll give up these artifacts that we have in our home, and we'll put them in universities and museums for the public to see. But they're still ours, but we'll put them for the public to see. And then even to this day, when you go to a museum, you'll often see a little label beside of it that will say, courtesy of the, this person and that person family foundation, because they still actually own them. They're just allowing the museum to show them. That way they got to keep them technically. They looked charitable and nice, and they were able to continue this looting and the, discovery in the name of science. And so they had to scientize it to make it look, like it wasn't what it was, which was initially landed gentry going out and looting and pillaging and coming back with the spoils and saying, ha ha ha,
there's a comedian that makes a whole shtick about taking everything back to England and showing it to everybody. Look what we've taken. And congratulations.
Right. Yeah. So, that's where it comes from. And if you consider, when you find something, if you were to find something, even in what's called in situ, so you find it and you say, okay, well, this is where it is. This is where it's been. We can understand a little of the context because of that. But overall, there's a lot of gaps. What's the story? Was it put there afterward? Was it reburied? Has it always been there? Why is it there? These are things that can't possibly be known half the time. Right. So there is this level of qualitative analysis that has to go into it that warrants it as a soft science, something along the line of a social science, like like psychology or even history, humanities, that sort of thing. And that's fine, but sometimes people need reminded of that because it looks highly scientific since the field uses scientific and technological tools like ground penetrating radar or satellites or, X-rays or a whole host of more clinical tools. And so it gives this sense of legitimacy, and it is legitimate, but there is still room for negotiation. There's room for a discussion and multiple ideas. And so it's important when people propose different ideas and different ways of sorting through the historical data points that, people understand that the consensus of the mainstream is still just, weaving together a story based on those historical data points. So, and that's not to negate it. Right. It's not to say that one can't be better than the other, or of course not, but it's just to remind people that it is valid and acceptable to still have questions and to still, think that perhaps the so-called experts, they don't know. They can only, postulate or hypothesize or, give us really good ideas of what it probably could be or what have you. But,
Yeah, because, if all we have is bones and sandals, what do we really have? Bones and sandals. Yeah, the thing is like the difference between the antiquarian view of things is it's basically the study of history through an antique, right? So they're like looking at this vase and going, oh yeah, that was ancient Greece. But the whole thing, then archaeology kicks off, and archaeology is like you said, it's a soft science. They want to take that antique and then look at it scientifically, which is really interesting because if you look at somebody like Aleister Crowley, who actually had said magic is the method of science and the aim of religion, right? So we've got a guy, member of a secret society, well, one of the older ones, he was Golden Dawn. And then, obviously, we know Aleister Crowley. But the thing is, he starts out in the Golden Dawn. That's a secret society. And those guys had a fascination with ancient Egypt because all of their rituals are Egyptian in origin. And it's clearly, and to be part of this society, you had to be somebody with money because that's what they wanted. That's what they liked having in their group. Fancy gentleman's club, really. But it's always been a fascination with magic in the elite power structure, even all the way back, like you said, Edwardian. Even Queen Elizabeth I, John Dee and Edward Kelly, and they're talking to entities. And that's what I find really interesting is whether or not those two dudes were charlatans and they were just working on a cipher system and that's a whole nother ballgame. But the fact is they attest to talking to at least 7 different entities.
Yeah. That's a very interesting case too. Something that I've noticed along the way when you look at the different accounts through history of people in positions of power who are seeking to harness the power of magic, particularly with reaching out to these entities of whatever they may be. Often what happens is once they are able to make contact with these entities, they're given access to some sort of life-changing technology. And you see that happen with Queen Elizabeth's time. I mean, wow, the world changed completely when she was reigning. She had all of the different discoveries and through navigation and the different tools and things they were allowed to have. It was amazing time of exploration due to technology, lots of technological advancements because of John Dee and Edward Kelly. I always thought it was particularly John Dee though, but I always thought it was interesting those two having the disagreements that they had with the question of, are we speaking to angels? Are these actually good, or perhaps they're not good? And not having that clear answer. And that bothers me. That's something that keeps me up at night.
What was really interesting with their relationship and their dynamic and their system, they didn't call it Enochian magic at the time. That came later. That's kind of something that the Golden Dawn put onto it. But their system of magic involved communication with unknown forces, sinister forces, honestly, because they began to be told to do things that violated the normal order, the natural order of things. So basically they were told to swap wives, for example. And so it's like this kind of behavior in a Christian world, an angel wouldn't say, hey, you should probably swap wives, right? That just doesn't follow. But if you were to trace that and you go, okay, let me just look somewhere else where some kind of sexual iniquity happened, we can actually go back to like Genesis chapter 6, where it actually talks about the sons of God come down and mate and make wives of whom they chose, right? That's not, hey, I'm going to propose and I'm going to date and I'm going to ask this woman to be my wife. That's, you're my wife now. And so the entities speaking to John Dee and Edward Kelly say swap wives. That just leads to further, weird stuff as you read later research that comes out of them too. But there's just more and more occult. Like you said, they've getting technology. You go back, you look at Genesis, it's like these guys got technology on how to kill people better. I mean, the sword pops up out of nowhere. The sword has one function, and that's killing people, right? Who just comes up with this idea, hey, we need to kill people better. We already have the bow. We can kill people from a distance. No, we need to do it up close and personal, which doesn't make sense to me if I have a bow, right? Well, if we follow the magical system of John Dee and Edward Kelly through time, and we kind of follow other occult elites, we lead up to somebody that, Aleister Crowley said he was a reincarnation of, and that's Eliphas Livy. And we spoke about him briefly in our last conversation, but now in October, you've announced that your book is coming out. Thanks. Congrats.
I'm doing a tour too.
You're going to do a book tour. That's awesome.
I'm doing a book
You coming
tour,
to Portland, Oregon?
I'm going the opposite way. I'm going to go to the East. I'm going to Salem, Massachusetts, and all that good stuff in October. Yeah.
That's awesome. But the thing is it's like you also have this other guy, and he's trying to formulate, and we spoke about this, he's trying to formulate true Catholicism in this communist kind of situation.
Yeah, well, I think what struck me as most interesting was the fact that he was deeply Catholic, before he wasn't, but he came out of that tradition. And I felt as though he was very genuine in his search for answers, that this wasn't something that was necessarily just about getting money and power, although, he had opportunities then to get money and power. His book was an actual bestseller. It was read by the likes of Oscar Wilde and all kinds of different, movers and shakers and sort of a bohemian romantic era kind of thing. It was really interesting. So he became really popular among poets and people in sort of that Gothic romantic era and then beyond. So he got a little bit of a cult following because of that. But coming at it from, I think, this genuine perspective of wanting to make the world a better place, or, have like a unity with God, and what he viewed as you said, the true Catholicism, which in his mind kind of coincided with Catholicism,
Right.
or with socialism.
Yeah.
That we could all just be one and be together. I think that, he really believed in this duality of like white magic, black magic, or left-hand path, right-hand path, but thought that they were all kind of part of one whole magical force, at the end of the day, which is sort of exemplified in that Baphomet where, there's this duality here where there's the left hand, the right hand, there's two genders, there's, all of the different symbols of the binary, but put together as like one whole being, to sort of say, these may be these different paths, but, together there's some neutral force here that we can harness. But he was considered an actual magician, which, like that he could actually manifest. And, a lot of people found his work to be very inspiring, very important. And strangely, it went a little mainstream in his time.
Yeah, like you were saying, on the statue, he's got this, the tattoos show solve and then coagula, which is the occult phrase, solve et coagula, which is to dissolve and then reform oneself. And so, like you said, you've got hermaphroditic entity, implying that as above, so below, needs to be turned into basically androgynous is the aim, right? So everything is the same, socialistically true equality.
And I think that's, that was that's maybe a cornerstone of his approach to magic, was this idea of making things whole, or kind of integrating elements of various traditions like Christian mysticism, integrated Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and even tarot, and to kind of make this cohesive system of magical thought. He was also very much into symbols as being powerful tools for manifesting spiritual realities. So, I imagine a lot of that was reinforced with his Catholicism. Catholicism is heavily focused on things like images, icons, Stations of the Cross, statues, that sort of thing. So, he was really interested in symbols, and that led him to draw the Baphomet image. But he thought that the imagination in particular, which we may see that sounds like a bad thing, you have a vivid imagination, that's what you're seeing, it just makes it sound like it's nothing, like you're just imagining, therefore it's, right. Illegitimate somehow, but he believed the opposite. He thought that the imagination was key to magic. I mean, if it's mad, like it's magical imagination.
Right.
And so he thought that if you, in a way, could imagine something, you could shape it and direct the energy and even the entities that you could imagine into a magical work. And so that took he proposed a lot of different ways to do this, but it was work. It was definitely work through meditation and contemplation and a lot of other things.
You can read a novel and you can imagine yourself being in the story. Whereas in the occult world, the imaginal is the new word for what Eliphas Levi was doing. And then the imaginal is the ability to hone your thoughts, intentions, and will into a specific thing and make it happen. Well, that's the methodology that's used to tell us what history really is. Historical cover-up is nothing new. And when we're just finding these bits and pieces and we start talking about people, oh, well, this guy was never Catholic, he was always an occultist. It's like, well, what about Albert the Great? He was a practicing occultist. King James, author of the King James Bible, was a practicing occultist. there's no end to the reality that when you're an elite, you're kind of doing these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of these ideas intersect, like with someone like Levy. He was also sort of in these crowds. He had somebody who was I believe a baroness offer to fund a lot of his research,
Exactly.
and his work. He wasn't just some dude on the street. Like he was a mover and a shaker.
Right.
And it's often people in those positions of power. They are looking for those who could help them either, secure their own power,
Yes.
or get more power. And so it is about power in all forms. And so you do follow the money, and that you'll find the magicians around that too.
Well, yeah, that reminds me of, what's the guy's last name? Thyssen? Massive financier of the Nazi party.
Yes. Massive. The Thyssen family dynasty, one of the richest families in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It was accepted that they had the world's largest and most valuable private collection of artifacts and art that, was confirmed. They think maybe Queen Elizabeth II had more, but they don't know for sure. So, when you're talking at that level, that's huge. But they, the family themselves came from Germany and started doing what, a lot of these older banking kind of elites did, which they started moving and spreading out to various countries and spread in what I would call a corporate imperialist fashion, similar to how the Rothschilds did. And then of course they would intermarry and kind of setting like a parallel dynastic royal family. So they would do similar things to keep bloodlines in order and to try to, integrate their fortunes and this sort of thing. But for anyone listening, the Thyssen, the name may ring a bell because we would know him as someone who established steelworks and escalators and elevators. And so you might be on an elevator and see like Thyssen written on the elevator. And so, but hugely rich bloodline powerhouse, and was the first man to get the early Nazi party off the ground by giving them lots of money, and as early as the mid 1920s. So, he was really a founding member, what we will say. But in 1931, he actually joined the party and became buddies with Hitler, and then continued to use his offshore banks at the time to just feed the Nazi war machine, and, acquired this nickname or this moniker of Hitler's most important financier. And he was asked about that once, and he was quoted as saying something to the effect of, I realized his what did he say? I realized his gifts of speaking and his gift of leading the masses, but what impressed me most was the order that resigned over his meetings and his military discipline of his followers.
Right.
And so he kind of recognized that wow, he was charismatic and could lead the crowd, but then at the same time, when he could drum up what would seem like a little bit of, like chaos, he had a very disciplined militaristic following. And so he saw that as like a synergy of just power, which clearly then it was. But he was very influential, and he persuaded other German industrialists to just keep on donating. And so he was a huge Nazi supporter. And incidentally, he was related to we'll say not by blood, but by friends, we'll say.
Yeah.
He was friends with members of an order called the Skull and Bones.
Right.
And so he was associated, shall we say, with, these people, these Nazi bankers. One was someone named Knight Woolley.
Okay.
And he was a director of a trust and also the director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York at the time. And and I've not been able to confirm this, and I'm still looking, but I've not been able to confirm whether or not he was related to Leonard Woolley. So that's something that, if anybody knows out there and they want to email me with that information, I'm still trying to look into that a little bit, because I did see somewhere that they were related, that they were cousins, but I have not been able to verify that with any level of confidence. But yeah, and so in that whole group too was a bunch of people, right? But one in particular was Prescott Sheldon Bush,
Right.
And
just about to ask.
He was the father of George Herbert Walker Bush. So, I mean, it's like, oh, wait, we got some dots, So we think these obscure names, maybe just the guy that has the, elevator company and, he made a lot of money in Germany and he was a little eccentric and gave Hitler some money. No, it's not just a one-off thing.
Right.
This was a massive, massive funding of this venture of Nazism. And like, what is that? Why? Was it because they all wanted to just simply kill Jews? I don't think so. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Skull and Bones Society of Yale is the main culprit there that you're talking about. But see, what leads to that, interestingly enough, isn't just merely the gathering and collecting of artifacts of different type, from pottery shards to full-on scrolls and cuneiform tablets, is what happens in some of these locations. In living memory is ISIS and what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, with, thousands of years of surviving history, all the way up to the point where they tried to wipe out the Yazidi people, which quite honestly might very well be the surviving members of the ancient Sumerian culture. We don't know. And we lose so much artifacts when people are just paid to go in and destroy history, right? But it didn't just happen there. It happened in Brazil. I mean, this is just 2018, right? And we lost, what was it, more information than we could have lost at the Library of Alexandria.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, these things don't just happen in a vacuum.
No, they don't. And it seems, I know it can come across as uber, like tinfoil hat,
Super.
to say, oh, the Nazis were involved and da da da. But it's not something that was just, from World War II and then we've moved on. They have a long reach, and people who have been not only related ideologically, but related by blood are still up to the same tricks. And so, like the Thyssen family, for instance, still going strong. The latest was Baron Lorne von Thyssen, and that individual, also a huge art collector and a collector of artifacts, particularly Near Eastern artifacts, interestingly enough. But he, he just wealthy, kind of obscure, is a playboy and somebody who, had partied a lot, but didn't make it known, wasn't someone that had a huge social media following or something like that, was very secret. And it was his nanny once said in a publication that his childhood was like living in a gilded cage. So just strange, interesting people. But why I bring him up is he's still involved in personally funding excavations in Iraq. And I always think, like, well, if they're out there doing that, that's just one of many examples, but if they're out there doing that and these are obviously known collectors, are we to believe that they're not just practicing antiquarianism? Or are we not to think that they're out there maybe stumbling upon something of great value to human knowledge, and then they just say, well, I mean, I'd go out on a limb so far as to say, well, what if they even find something about some ancient technology, something that's like, 0-point gravity or one of these things that people like to talk about. But something tells me, based on just my research that a lot of these individuals who happen to also be occultists, they're looking for having an edge, a technological edge over the people, and they want to control, and that they've been in that sort of mode for so long, and that looking to the past is a way that they can exercise that to hopefully find, whether it be some kind of magical text or, like you said, like the Spear of Destiny or something to that effect. But
well, yeah, that's the whole thing. Is in the book of Jubilees, it talks about basically one of the sons of Noah finds a tablet that was written by the fallen angels, by the Watchers themselves, and that tablet eventually is given to Nimrod, and that's how Nimrod becomes a gigantus. He becomes this giant through, ritual, to put it point blankly. And can there be a drive or a propulsion for people to find something to become more powerful? I mean, that sure seemed to be the desire of Aleister Crowley. That seemed to be why he warned Parsons not to engage in the Babylon working, because he didn't understand the forces that was involved. I mean, he called them louts, that they thought this was an easily attainable thing. Parsons eventually died in an experimental explosion in his own garage. You get L. Ron Hubbard, who was clearly inspired to create what became Dianetics and then Church of Scientology. These philanthropists are creating systems through inspiration. There's no doubt about it. But are they getting that inspiration from something they've found or something that they are talking to?
Right. Yeah. And you know what if it's a little of both? Maybe, some of these things they may find, and this is just super speculation. Yes. This is sort of just a what if some of the, so like I'm interested in this object spoken about in the Sumerian literature called the Tablet of Destinies. And so, that's the divine and powerful tablet that the fates of gods and humans and even the universe are written on that. And it was one of those symbols of legitimacy. So whoever possessed the Tablet of Destinies, they had the right to rule over the universe and control the fates of the beings within it. So it's like uber powerful. So if and you see this a lot with all these different tablets and things that give people this power, right? But what if, so it's a thing in and of itself, but what if the writing comes from above? So what if it's like automatic writing?
Okay.
So it was a little bit of both, if you look at it from that, maybe a Abrahamic kind of point of view, you could think of the 10 Commandments in such a way that although they were written down, by a human, they were dictated by God. So perhaps, there's a little bit of that going on too, where, and it's something that, I see come up a lot in the occult. I especially, I've looked into a lot of theosophy and some of those, the Mahatma letters and that sort of thing where, very, very dependent on automatic writing or channeled information. So not 100% sure how I feel about that, honestly.
Well, I mean, there's, have you heard of the Maitreya? Have you heard that one?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. See, all of this is just, and they're always coming through. Are they eccentric or are they crazy? What's the difference?
Yeah. How much money you make.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, it's endlessly fascinating to me because I look at the structures of the past, this idea of that 200-year marker of going from that semi-settled hunter-gatherer to having this high civilization in, Mesopotamia, and watching what did that mean? What did that look like? Well, it meant a hierarchical structure. It meant that there was a god positioned on the top of the pyramid, so to speak, and that there was a priest class then that would be the intermediary between the god and the people. And we start to see this whole system of, kind of just the, mystery traditions start to take hold. And with that then comes other structures of control, like banking and government. And I'm not saying I don't have a bank or I don't think there's a need for some sort of governance, but we just start to see those types of superstructures that take on lives of their own and that could easily become oppressive,
right?
Completely oppressive and enslave, so.
As we wrap up, go ahead and give your links, your deets, and what's coming up for Midnight Academy.
I'm really excited about that. So the first season, I had a short season. It was a beta test launch, and I had some episodes with some friends of mine to, try to make sure we got everything, tested and measured and see what we got. And so learned a lot of lessons, learned a couple things, took feedback from people, and, went back to the drawing board. Not anything too different, but just tweaking here and there, things like intro and sound quality, and also then getting, other guests on that have wanted to come on. And so very, very much looking forward to that. I have a few episodes launching next week, and one of those is going to be with a leader in the Raelian UFO cult.
Okay.
That's
it can be interesting.
Fun and interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Not what I expected in the interview. So it was quite fun and interesting. So, another one with Joseph Selby talking about consciousness and that sort of thing. But I have a bunch of people lined up. I'm so excited. I feel like this is going to be this is going to be a hard launch. So the first one was like a soft launch, but this season 2,
you're going for it.
It going for it all the way, full throttle, because I went like double renegade here, and I'm like full timing this now. So I had enough of that school. I'm telling you, this is just not it.
drheatherlynn.com and Baphomet coming to a bookstore. You can pre-order it on Apple Books, Amazon, and I think your website leads to places you can pre-order.
Yeah, Barnes & Noble, I think, has an option too. But yeah, that's coming out in October 1st for the Baphomet, and I have the Final Frontier will be available in March 31st.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, no, anytime. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.